Hello, scholars. This is Keith Hammond, and I want to give you some quick ideas about how you can use setting to analyze your short stories. If you want to learn about setting in a story, Disney is a great place to start. Very visual, and even the youngest viewer understands intuitively the mood that a particular setting creates. Dark clouds and rough seas mean trouble. Calm, clear seas mean that all is well. Of course, the settings of our stories are not always so obvious, but they do help carry the meaning of a story, and you can explore a story through a careful analysis of its setting. Consider again the setting of William Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily. Now, like many of Faulkner's stories, this story is set in the imaginary town of Jefferson, Mississippi, in the aftermath of the American Civil War in the late 1800s, and it ends in about 1930 with Miss Emily's funeral. This is the Reconstruction period of the American South after its defeat in the Civil War. You can hardly begin to understand Faulkner's story unless you know what small-town Mississippi was like during this Reconstruction period. You must understand the social, political, economic, religious, and intellectual atmosphere of the culture. You must also understand the implications of Miss Emily's house, a setting within a setting. Much of the story happens here, and Faulkner describes the house throughout the story. By the second paragraph, we already begin to suspect that this, quote, big squarish frame house that had once been white, end quote, is not simply a backdrop, a stage curtain against which the action of the story unfolds. Rather, its, quote, stubborn and coquettish decay, end quote, says something about Miss Emily, about her father, and about the long line of Griersons stretching back into the history of Jefferson, Mississippi. The house holds a secret in its upper chambers, the decaying corpse of Homer Barron, a corpse that Miss Emily sleeps with for 40 years or so. And when we learn later in the story that the house stinks, we begin to wonder if that is all that stinks. Maybe Miss Emily and all that she represents of a vanquished Southern aristocracy built on the backs of slave labor and working class folk, maybe that aristocracy also stinks. Maybe that's why Faulkner gives Emily a rose, to cover up the smell. If you find the setting of a story intriguing and interesting, then you will always start by rereading the story with setting in mind. Mark all the places where setting is mentioned or described, but remember, even when setting isn't mentioned, it's always there. Action always takes place somewhere and sometime. That's the setting. And you can always explore the interactions between the action in a story and the setting for those actions. How does the setting support the action? How does the setting complement or conflict with the action? For instance, a stolen kiss at a party is very different from a stolen kiss at a funeral. Different settings, different meanings, even though the action's the same. Going out for a Sunday ride with Homer Barron, then, is a very different thing for Miss Emily in small-town Mississippi than it would be in New York City. Setting also provides an entry into a story for those who are not English majors. And this is important because most of you are not English majors. For instance, if your interests deal with history, say, then you can easily analyze the historical developments during the Reconstruction period in Mississippi, showing how Northern industry flooded the South with Reconstruction efforts and how that historical development helps us understand the Yankee Homer Barron coming south to Mississippi to construct sidewalks. What would the locals have thought about Homer? Does this historical fact help us understand Faulkner's story better? Probably. It will certainly help you write an essay that you find somewhat interesting. Maybe you're interested in architecture. So what can architecture tell us about the house, its style, its construction methods? And would that help us understand the story better? Probably. Maybe sociology is your thing. So what do we need to know about how a region defeated in war goes about rebuilding itself and regaining its dignity? And does that help us understand Faulkner's story better? Well, almost certainly it does. It also helps you write your paper. Does that explain why the townspeople are giving a rose to Emily? Of course, partly as a tribute to a fallen monument, but also partly to cover up the smell of a system that has decayed and now stinks. Does it help explain why Toby, Miss Emily's manservant, almost a slave, disappears at the end of the story, never to be seen again? Probably. The point is, if you work with the story's setting, then you might find an angle on the story that's more to your liking than a straight literary analysis of the symbolism or the tone. And this sort of outside angle can lead to a fine essay that helps us understand the story better than we did. As you can see, if you reread the story carefully through the lens of setting, looking for ways that setting interplays with the characters, the plot, the theme, especially with those outside academic and professional interests that you might have, then you can easily find an angle for a fine essay that will bring real insight and value to your colleagues. And after all, that's the point of writing your essay. I thank you for listening all the way to the end. If you have questions, be sure to ask me, and I'll see you on the net.